So welcome everyone. Thank you guys so much for coming. This is the second event in our Document Detectives webinar series, and we are really excited about it. This event, the presentation is called Hiding in Plain Sight, Researching Black History in Montana and Missoula, and it's being presented by Greg Martin, whom you can see here. Before we start, just a couple notes of housekeeping. This webinar is going to go for about an hour, including time for questions. So if you have any questions, just drop them in the Q&A box, and we will answer them either in the middle or at the end, kind of depending on when they come in. Like I mentioned a minute ago, this webinar is being recorded, and it will be available on the Historical Museum's website and social media page after the presentation. And then if you guys in the chat want to just say hi, introduce yourselves, tell us where you're from, maybe where you heard about us, just sort of so that we can get a sense of where y'all are at. And I think with that, we will formally get started. So I'd like to begin this event by acknowledging that the Historical Museum at Fort Missoula acknowledges that we are in the homeland of the Salish and Kalispel people. We offer our respect for their history and culture and for their wisdom in caring for this place for generations to come. I would also like to introduce today's speaker. Greg Martin is a writer and researcher from Missoula. He has spent the past 4 years looking into Black history in Missoula and Montana at large. He's written 3 articles on the subject on the website Medium: Hiding in Plain Sight, St. Paul African Methodist Episcopal Church and Missoula's Forgotten Black History, Call Him William, and the Resilient Shellmans, and we'll drop links to those at the end. Greg has a master's degree in journalism from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and he got his undergraduate degree here at the University of Montana. He also administers the Facebook page Black History in Montana, which we will also drop you guys a link to. And with that, Greg, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Anne. Thanks, Jesse, for putting this together. It's really important. I'm just so glad that Historic Fort Missoula is doing this. I also wanted to thank Professor Mark Johnson for his presentation last month on the history of the Chinese in Montana. It's such a vital insight into our history. And it reminds me of a key quote that I keep in mind a lot when doing the work that I'm doing. It was on an article about racial exclusion in Oregon by a writer named Matt Novak. And he said, the racial composition of any city is a product of its history. This may seem painfully obvious, but it's something we need to say out loud and type in bold letters to fully appreciate. And that is something that I keep in mind all the time while doing this research. I'm not a historian, but I love historians, especially ones doing sort of this truer, more expansive work. For my area in early Black history, I'm really grateful for the work of historians like Delia Hagen and Anthony Wood and others who are applying this focus to Montana and the West in general. And if I could, I'd also like to give a shout out to the Extreme History Project. They are a wonderful organization doing this vital work. If you aren't aware of them, you should check them out. They also have a fantastic podcast series called The Dirt on the Past, and I strongly recommend you check that out too. So I want to talk today about Missoula's Black history, Missoula's Black population, in 1910, the significance of it and how it represented the seed of a potential for a vibrant Black community, potential that sadly went unmet. I thought I'd start off with a question. So it's a poll question. You're looking at a property deed transfer record showing the purchase of the land on Phillips Street in Missoula by St. Paul African Methodist Episcopal Church. On this form are the names of the trustees of the church, Chester McNorton, that says Rolla C. Bibbs, but his name was actually Raleigh C. Bibbs. G.T. Kinchin was the pastor, Edward Leroy, and Alexander Pillow. Now Chester, Raleigh, and Alexander Pillow all have something in common. And can you guess what it was? So the options are A, they were born into slavery. B, they all went on to be ministers. C, they had been 25th Infantry soldiers. D, they ran the Hawthorne Club, also known as the Colored Club, on the 200 block of West Front Street. Or E, they were members of the Triumphant 10 Lodge, number 29 FNAM, a local Black fraternal organization that met twice a week at Union Hall. So feel free to answer the poll question. I can't see any results. I don't know if people are voting or not.
We've got about 15 responses so far, so
okay,
we'll go another couple seconds here.
Okay, can you? I'm just curious what most of them are. What most of them selected, because I can't see actually what people.
All right, we'll wait out until we hit a minute.
Okay.
We are all right. We have ended the polling. Can you guys see the results on screen?
Yeah. Yeah, and the majority, or the majority is right. They had been 25th Infantry soldiers. So yeah, Chester, Raleigh, and Alexander Pillow were 25th Infantry soldiers, also known as Buffalo Soldiers. The Segregated Army Infantry Division, that along with the 24th Infantry and the 9th and 10th Cavalry Division, were stationed at forts throughout the West to protect colonizing West settlers from native attacks, though they did little of that in Missoula. The 25th Infantry did little of that in Missoula. So you can see their military records here. Both Chester and Alexander were stationed or they were discharged at Fort Missoula. I couldn't find any enlistment records for Raleigh placing him at Fort Missoula, but I do have his Army pension file that shows he was a 25th Infantry soldier. I got these from Fold 3, which is a digital archive of military records. Should add that both the Hawthorne Club and the Colored Club and the Triumphant 10 Fraternal Society actually did exist in Missoula. The Triumphant 10 Lodge likely started in the early 1920s, and the Hawthorne Club / Colored Club operated on Front Street from around the turn of the 20th century to about 1960. So it's important, especially considering this event is hosted by the Historic Museum of Fort Missoula, that we understand the history and the role of these soldiers played in the early Black settlement of the West. Of the 162 Black residents in Missoula County from the 1910 census, the year the AME Church began, I've been able to identify 13 who were 24th or 25th Infantry soldiers. So when you include their family members, almost a quarter of Missoula's Black population in 1910 was connected to the Buffalo Soldiers. So I just want to step back in the way of introduction and give you a little background on myself. So I was born in 1971 in a small town in California called Weaverville, which is part of Trinity County. In 1983, I moved with my family to Helena in the 6th grade, where I went to junior high and high school, graduating in 1989. After that, I attended the University of Montana here in Missoula, starting in 1989, graduating in 1994. In the fall of 1996, my wife and I moved to Madison, Wisconsin to attend the University of Wisconsin. We lived there for about 1.5 years. And then for a year, I really like to think about, we moved to Ottumwa, Iowa in Wapello County, where I was a reporter for the year of 1998. In 1999, we moved back to Missoula and we have stayed here for the past 22 years. So I bring all this up to make a very important point. I've lived my whole life in disproportionately white places. I've spent my life not really even thinking about the why or the how of it. I feel it's something I have to acknowledge right away because it speaks to the most significant barrier that I face looking into this. I'm a white person who has always lived in overwhelmingly white places, who can't really know what it's like to live here as a person of color. I'm also limited by the fact that I have a day job and family that occupy a lot of my time. And I'm only discovering in my mid to late 40s that I'm genuinely passionate about history. This discovery has come with a parallel realization that I, like many of us, was poorly educated about our nation's history. So it's imperative to me that while I start to look into these things, I also devote as much time to learning the history that I failed to learn at a younger age. I still have much to learn, but reading national histories focused on race is absolutely essential when doing this as a white researcher, and to get perspectives on history from a multitude of different sources. It's much easier to contextualize local events and see broader national trends and local news stories. So as Professor Johnson pointed out in his presentation last month, the most valuable sources looking into this history are primary sources from a Black perspective. These sources are few and far between in what I'm sure will be a consistent theme of this series. One of the obvious reasons for that is our very small Black population and how very few ever grew roots here for longer than 2 or 3 decades. But just as importantly, these sources are hard to find because the greater white community did not value their presence in town. It's why it's so hard to find something so ordinary as a photograph. In fact, I think you're going to see that the history I've found so far is from overwhelmingly white sources that end up telling us more about what white people in this town, telling us more about white people in this town than what it was like to be Black here. And that's actually my main orientation anyways, is to examine the way the greater white community thought of, talked about, and interacted with Missoula's early Black population. So we know we live in a very, very white state, and it's easy to see our surroundings in terms of the people we see and interact with every day as having always been that way. You know, Montana is currently the least Black state in the country, but I hope to show that it wasn't always that way, and a closer look shows that Missoula had the potential for a larger Black population than we have now. While Black pioneers came to this territory even prior to the 1860s, they were a definite presence in Helena by the 1870s. The population really started to grow in the late 1880s when the 25th Infantry were posted in Forts Custer, Missoula, and Shaw. More started to arrive at other forts in the early 1890s. So you can see that dramatic rise in the 1890 census when Montana reached its all-time high in its share of the population that was Black. It was 1.13%. Missoula's was higher at 2.18% because of Fort Missoula, but it's misleading to say that Missoula ever really got to being even 1% Black because most of those counted in 1890 were soldiers stationed here temporarily. The bulk of those soldiers departed the state in early 1898 to fight in the Spanish-American War. And you can see here a famous Missoula history photo of the town coming out to say farewell as they departed. So from most accounts, it appeared Missoula residents were quite fond of the 25th Infantry soldiers. They had been part of the town's community life, including the 25th Infantry Band that you can read a lot more about on Historic Fort Missoula's website. So you can see a noticeable drop in the 1900 census reflecting that change. But something interesting happened in 1910. Missoula's Black population increased noticeably. See, I talk a lot and I think a lot about 1910 and the significance of the population captured by the census then. This was the same year St. Paul AME Church started on the 1400 block of Phillips Street. It also represents the high water mark of Black proportion of the county's population that exclusively includes people who came here to live, not because they were stationed here as soldiers. So before going on, I'd like to discuss an issue I've experienced with Missoula's 1910 census that speaks to the document detective aspect of this series and the challenges of interpreting the public documents you encounter. So really quickly, a note about terms. So the census had a general count of Black people that they labeled Negro. And under that category of Negro, the census had 2 designations, B for Black and MU for mulatto, lighter skinned Black people. So I've gone through the entire manuscript census and have jotted down the names of every resident with a racial category of B or MU, and I count 162 people with that designation. So the overview census reports a population for Missoula County of 133. I had wondered if that count only included those in the city limits, but the breakdown later in the report shows 120 Black residents living in the city of Missoula. My total is 146 in Missoula, with 16 living outside the city limits. If I were off by single digits, I wouldn't be too concerned, but this is, about 30 people, 29 people. So I want to show you an example from the census that posed difficulty for me in determining if the people indicated were Black, and also reveals why I think the 1910 number is a possible undercount. So here you see the 1910 entry for Jordan and Mary Binga on the 200 block of East 2nd Street. it definitely appears that Jordan is Black, and they have Mary listed as white. The racial category is kind of over there to the right, just past their names, and there's their wife or husband. So originally I had added Jordan to my spreadsheet of listed of people, but not Mary. I made a note that the Bingas were an interracial marriage, and there were a handful in Missoula at the time. But feeling a nagging urge to try to reconcile the difference between my count and the overview census, I recently went back through the census to check my work, and just wanted to kind of show you a little bit of what I found doing that. So if you examine that box for racial designation closer to Jordan, the column to the right, it looks like the census taker had perhaps written a W and then wrote a B over it. Or maybe they wrote a B first and then wrote a W over it. His wife, after all, is listed as white. So then I looked at the other context clues on this census: his place of birth and his parents' place of birth. See, and you can see the census says he was born in Canada, over there, English-speaking Canadian, for all three. His parents is being born there as well. So that's not very typical for a Black man living in Montana in 1910 to be born in Canada and whose parents were born in Canada. Not out of the realm of possibility, but it raised a red flag. The other context clue, his occupation is listed there as porter for the railroad. And that's a very typical job for a Black man in Missoula in 1910. In fact, and if anyone can correct me, I'd love to know. I don't know if there were white porters for the railroad at that time. Luckily, Jordan had an uncommon surname. So I went to newspapers.com. I have a subscription to newspapers.com, and I searched the Missoulian digital archives for Jordan Binga between the years 1890 and 1920. I came across a few mentions of him in the paper in the late 1890s and early 1900s, but none of them identified him by race and were mostly about a homestead claim dispute that he had with the Northern Pacific Railroad. Often newspaper accounts of Black citizens include a racial description, despite the fact that it's almost never relevant to the story. I also haven't run across too many accounts of civil legal cases brought by Black men. So all those non-definitive pieces was enough to cast doubt in my mind that Binga was Black. I couldn't find any Missoula references of him later than 1910. So I decided to do a full search on newspapers.com digital archives, which includes, a large collection of newspapers across the country for the name Jordan Binga in the late 19th and early 20th century. So one of the first ones that popped up is this snippet from the Richmond Planet in Richmond, Virginia in 1919. So I did not know at the time that the Richmond Planet was a Black-owned newspaper. I'm constantly learning things as I go about this. What caught my attention, though, was that this Jordan Binga was visiting from Wallace, Idaho, very close by. So I went to Ancestry.com and searched the 1920 census for a Jordan Binga in Wallace, Idaho. And lo and behold, here is that listing, and it shows pretty clearly Binga's racial designation is Black. Beyond that, it says he was born in Canada, consistent with the 1910 census, but in this record, his dad was born in Kentucky and his mom was born in Tennessee, which wasn't indicated on the 1910 census. So that sealed it for me, and I kept Jordan on the list. But then I wondered about his wife, Mary. Was she really white? The 1910 census had her born in Virginia, and her parents were also listed as having been born in Virginia as well. So I started a tree on Ancestry with Jordan and Mary Binga with their date of birth and a life event of living in Missoula in 1910. So if you're familiar with Ancestry, then they start to give you hints or records that match or closely match the basic description that you'd entered. And so one of the first records was this 1924 obituary from the Missoulian. I guess I should have searched for Mary in the Missoulian, but I hadn't at that point. And in that obituary, it states she was the wife of Jordan Binga and that she was well known in colored circles. But it didn't say she was Black specifically. And as far as I knew, her connection with the Black community could be because of her Black husband. So this obituary gave me the date of death for Mary in Ancestry, which then revealed her death certificate. So not all states provide Ancestry with the actual written copy of death, marriage, or birth certificates. Thankfully, Montana does, and they're really helpful when doing this research. And here you see Mary's race listed as colored, and everything else matches up. Her husband is Jordan Binga, who lives in Wallace, Idaho, and she was born in Virginia. So I added her to my listing. If I hadn't checked more closely on Jordan, I wouldn't have been able to count Mary. It's examples like this that make me wonder if the 1910 number was undercounted. And just a final point on this, the areas where there are the most judgment calls on these census records are residents with the MU mulatto designation. And when you're going through, I mean, we're still talking about less than 1% of the population. And when you're going through pages and pages of census, and most of them for racial designation have, are the slanted cursive W for white, it's quite easy to overlook a slanted cursive large M and a small U. So I think that could be part of why our counts are different. And I look at these things very closely. So it's important to me to get these numbers right because of the significance of the Black population in 1910. The word significance is key here. Is key here. It's not just about the numbers, but also about the proportion of the population and how that compares to the West at the time. There's no question that the numbers in Missoula and Montana at large are small in 1910. But if you look at other Western states that are fairly in line with the proportion, but if you look at other Western states, they are fairly in line with the proportion found in the West at the time. So in fact, just as an interesting perspective, I've got another poll, and that is to pick the top 2 counties in this list that you would guess had the highest proportion of their population that was Black. Multnomah County, which includes Portland, Laramie County, Wyoming, Los Angeles County, California, Lewis and Clark County, Montana, and King County, which includes Seattle, Washington. So yeah, pick the top 2, what you think it would have the top 2 proportions, not number, but proportion of the population.
All right, just a couple more seconds. There we go.
Yeah, listen, people know about Helena. Yeah, Lewis and Clark County. Yeah, Los Angeles is close. But actually, the winner by a long shot is Laramie County, Wyoming. Now, a good chunk of Laramie County's Black population then were 9th Cavalry soldiers stationed at Fort D.A. Russell, but Cheyenne also had a significant Black population, and Laramie County at the time also included Empire, Wyoming, which is adjacent to Torrington, Wyoming. Now a ghost town, Empire was an all Black community. That is a very interesting history that I encourage you to check out. The second highest is Lewis and Clark County, whose population in 1910 was nearly 2% Black. Helena had a vibrant Black community in the beginning of the 20th century. There were 2 Black churches, a Black-run newspaper, Black-run businesses, civic groups, women's groups, etc. You know, as I mentioned earlier, I spent my junior high and high school years in Helena and didn't know a thing about this. It's local historical malpractice, in my view. Los Angeles County, while obviously having more Black residents, had a slightly smaller proportion than Lewis and Clark at 1.87. King County was slightly less than 1% at 0.87% Black. And Portland's Multnomah County, we stumble with that one, had a smaller proportion than Missoula County at 0.48%. So another way to look at this is Missoula's share of the population in 1910 was 0.69%, using my numbers. If you average the percent of the Black population in the West in 1910, you get 0.75% of the population. So Missoula is actually pretty close to the Western average at that time. By 1960, when Montana officially became the least Black state in the country, Missoula's share was at the bottom when compared to all Western states, including Montana as a whole, dropping in actual number and percent of the population, while the town and county grew significantly. Still, another way to look at this in terms of significance is that in 1910, just about 90% of the nation's Black population lived in the South. In the West, just about 0.5% of all Black people in the US lived in Western states. So this is before the Great Migration, which really got started after World War I. In current times, the West, I think, is about 10% of the nation's Black population live in the West right now. So anyway, this is probably a good point to stop and see if anyone has questions.
We do have a couple questions. So the first one that came in is talking about the bingas, and it says, do you have any sense of what is behind the census errors like Mary Binga? Was there a bias that would have made these errors go in one direction or the other? So like more Black people listed as white or vice versa?
No, I don't want to speculate on it necessarily, because I'm not 100% in tune with the methods that were used by census takers then. I think it's definitely a fact that they spent less time probably trying to get all the facts of people that were, especially in that area where Jordan and Mary Binga were. They were in the 200 block of, in the red light district, basically, of Missoula. And, you know, there's just, you know, you'd think that there's a lot of prejudice going on, you know, census takers when they're going in through those areas. But I don't know for sure. I do think it's probably more likely that, like, the MU issue is, because if you look at through these documents, it's really faint, and you can really easily overlook somebody that's designated as MU. And I mean, I would love for somebody else to go through this and check my work and you know, double check to see that if I'm missing something. But I've gone back and I relook at it and I check these things, and I think they've undercounted.
All right, and our next question is actually about the census methods. In the 1910 census, was the census of the Black community done by the main census takers or by a member of the Black community? And the asker adds, you know, Helena's was done by the publisher of a local Black newspaper.
Yeah, as far as I'm aware, that was completely unprecedented. As far as I know, everything that I've seen, that they were just the regular census takers, probably white. They did not specify special people, as far as I know, to go into, because there weren't Black neighborhoods per se. There were some areas where there were larger concentrations, but as I'm going to get into later, in the 4th Ward, the northwest side, I mean, they were dispersed throughout the area. So you wouldn't really know, really wouldn't be able to do that, you know, logistically.
All right, and we've got one more here. Did the one drop rule from slavery times carry through after the Civil War? And I assume this is the, you know, one drop of colored blood, as it were.
Oh yeah, I mean, yeah, if, you know, obviously the census taker, I'm assuming they ask them the question, and you know, they respond, but they also use their observational ability, and definitely anyone that, I mean, that's the whole issue with the difficulties and just, you know, how race is a social construction, because I mean, these things are just become silly when you think about it. If somebody is, you know, lighter skinned or has, you know, different, you know, physical phenotypical features, it's harder to make that judgment call. But it's about the way they were treated, and less about, you know, if they thought that the person had, you know, 1% or, you know, beyond that, a drop of, they would consider them, because they were often considered and treated as Black people, in a lesser status to white.
All right, we'll do one more, and then we'll continue with the presentation, and we'll ask any others that come in at the end. So our last question for the moment, I wonder if the release of Birth of a Nation might show a large decrease in the Black population between 1910 and 1920, due to an increase in KKK activity?
Well, actually, you know, and I'm going to get into this, the Black church that got started in Missoula in 1910, and it lasted through after the KKK. I don't think it was really that, I mean, I don't see any evidence to suggest that the Klan actively expelled or forced any Black folks out of there. The Klan history is tangled and interesting in Missoula, in Montana. They were very active in Missoula. I mean, they burned crosses on Waterworks Hill. You know, long before the peace sign was there, they were burning crosses. The Klan had burned crosses, but I didn't see any evidence of any active expulsion or intimidation other than, and I don't even mention this in the presentation, but there's a couple times that twice they entered the St. Paul AME church and disrupted their services, but it was to give them a donation because the AME church was Protestant, and AME church was sort of more in the Booker T. Washington line of not really challenging the racial order. So it's kind of complicated, but I think we overstate things when we look at the Klan as being the driving force behind this. I mean, there's just a lot of similarities between the general white community and how the Klan acted in Montana in the 1920s. And that's a really interesting time to understand the Klan is just different than the way we think of the Klan before and sort of even after that as being violent. Anyway, there's a lot that I could say about that, but I'll keep going. So, all right. So let's take a closer local look at Missoula in 1910. The Black population was large enough that the 5th District African Methodist Episcopal Church welcomed Missoula's St. Paul AME Church into its fold. On the April 6th Missoulian, it's reported that the old Lowell School building was sold to the African Methodist Episcopal Church for $200, with the requirement that the building be moved within 10 days to the lots the church had procured on the 1400 block of Phillips Street, which is part of the 4th Ward, and that's the historic northwest side of Missoula. So it was during that move that the neighborhood's racial fears and resentment exposed itself in print. So in an article that you see there with the headline of "Meeting Discusses Negro Question," the lead paragraph reads, "To take all lawful ways and means at our command to prevent the colonization of the West Side by Negroes." This was the sentiment of a meeting held at Lowell School for the purpose of discussing the Negro question on the West Side. Further down the article, the paper reports, another committee was appointed to wait on the real estate men handling property in that vicinity and asked them to refuse or to sell or rent any property in that district to the colored people. The feeling at the meeting was very high. Several Negro families have secured homes there, and it is feared that more will attempt to locate. So interestingly, also in that same article, the paper reported racial barriers already existing in the initial purchase of the lot before any of this occurred. They say, it was found upon investigation that the Negroes had applied to several real estate dealers for lots in that vicinity, but been refused. The site was finally obtained by getting the lots from real estate dealers in the names of white people, and then having the deeds transferred to the Negroes. The records I found for those lots do show 2 white buyers obtaining the properties in April of 1910, who eventually sold both to the AME Church. So just 4 days after the article about the uproar of the church and the Black population in the 4th Ward, a letter to the editor ran, signed only as a colored citizen, and it's one of those rare, primary sources from a Black perspective, which is so valuable. But of course, the writer would need to choose their words carefully, considering it was being run in the paper to a largely white community. But in the letter, they wrote, "As a colored citizen of the West Side, I would like to ask the white citizens there to explain their reasons for protesting against the Colored Methodist Church being located in that locality." They went on to say, "We would like to know why the colored people of the West Side have been called undesirable citizens. What have we done that this should be said of us? There is certainty about this question. Nature has placed us on earth, and we must have some place to live and some place to worship." So just 3 days later in the paper, another letter to the editor, signed a property owner and West Side resident, replied, and they provided a long-winded 4-point answer that pretty much sums up white supremacy in the West. So just do parts of that here. So they wrote, a colored population, be it good, bad, or indifferent, is never a desirable population in a white community. Natural, social, and civil law forbids the mixing of the white and black races. So note the use of the word natural there. It's difficult to overstate how pervasive the spread of crudely awful biological evolutionary science was in this era. You know, it was the era of eugenics and phrenology, which were widely accepted science. It also informed social science research as well, and it provided a seemingly objective rationale for overt discrimination. They also make a point that is the rationale behind the plethora of racially restrictive covenants and FHA redlining that would later occur in many urban areas across the country during the Great Migration. He writes, or she, who knows, the establishment of a Negro church in their midst and the consequent drifting in of a colored population and locating around the church will depreciate property values and necessitate removal of all white people who do not desire to live in a Negro community. So an organized group of residents in the neighborhood called the Fourth Ward Improvement Club held a couple of meetings in the wake of the church purchase focused on this issue. So on May 6th, the Missoulian reported on a meeting in which, quote, committees were appointed to take the matter up with the real estate dealers and the owners of property on the west side and get them to get rid of their Negro tenants. They said they would boycott them if they did not. So what is amazing to me about this is that the paper, again, as I mentioned before, already revealed the difficulties and barriers the church itself had to go through just to get the property in the first place. So, I mean, it just wasn't enough, apparently. So in that same meeting, reported on the next day, a man referred to only as a prominent businessman. He shared a story of observing two young black boys grabbing and kissing two white girls while he was out in his yard working. His story says he yelled at them and they ran away. And then he said, this shows what we must expect if the influx of the Negro into our midst is not checked. It will not be safe for our wives and daughters to move out of the house after dark. And this is such a revealing anecdote because it's no coincidence that it was black boys kissing white girls in this story. You know, it was such a commonly expressed fear of black people that the males were inherently sexual deviants who would defile the innocence of white girls and women. And so many lynchings in the South and other parts of the country revolved around black males' relationships with white females. So interestingly, the census was actually being conducted in the Fourth Ward at precisely the same time all this was happening, from mid-April to early May 1910. So we do have a snapshot of the neighborhood during all this uproar over the church and the area's black residents. So with the help of a friend of mine and using the Sanborn maps in the 1910 census, I put together this sort of crude map of black household in the Fourth Ward at the time. Now I'll again add the caveat that this is using my research in the 1910 census, which doesn't completely sync with the overall census numbers reported that year. And I also can't be 100% certain of the addresses, but I think the proximity is right based on the census districts. So you can see 21 households, fairly well spread out in the area. The households marked in yellow were homeowners, houses marked in orange were renters, and the gray households were ones I couldn't make a firm conclusion about due to illegibility. So every individual household had at least one adult holding a working class job, from porter to shoe shiner to janitor. And there were 6 men in that neighborhood who had been 25th Infantry veterans. Samuel Lundy, who had been a town's dog catcher for a time, later became a porter for the Northern Pacific Railroad. He lived in the North Side with his family and 5 children. William Caldwell and his wife and daughter, Richard Burney, Ephraim Dorsey and his family. His son James went on to be the first black graduate at UM Law School and was a prominent civil rights attorney in Milwaukee as an adult. And Lewis McDuffie, a porter at a hotel who lived with his sister on Cooper Street. So these are men who served American empire and settler colonialism as soldiers protecting white settlers on indigenous lands, and then later in US adventures in Cuba, who are now bearing the brunt of white supremacy. So of the 4 wards that made up the city of Missoula in 1910, about 42% of the town's black population lived in the Fourth Ward, with an almost equal amount in each enumerated district. Compare that with Ward 1, where over 2/3 of the Black population lived on just one block on Main Street. So a follow-up meeting on June 3rd of the 4th Ward Improvement Club indicated that the uproar had resulted in a displacement of at least some of the Black residents, with the paper reporting, quote, "The Negro question seems to be clearing up and several of the dusky residents have taken their departures to more neighborly zones." So I have no idea of the scale of that, but the North Side, West Side share and number of Black residents in 1920 definitely dipped. It's hard to state, exactly what happened there because, I just don't have enough other information on that. But, I think it did have a result. So I think you see this strong flexing of white supremacy there because their presence challenged the existing racial order. The Northwest Side was a growing working class neighborhood, a place they could form a community. And I haven't really run across this kind of openly hostile racial resentment in the red light district where there was a strong presence there as well. So it was obviously not an auspicious beginning for St. Paul AME Church, but that didn't stop them, and the church remained a reliable institution for the town's Black population for nearly 3 decades. For example, in 1913, the paper reported that the Reverend of the church, C.N. Douglas, was leading a committee called the Negro Citizens Alliance. The impetus of the organization was to oppose discriminatory signs that were displayed at the Empire Theater and at Pig's Tamale Parlor. The paper didn't indicate what the sign said, but it was clearly defamatory. "We think the signs displayed in the theater and in the restaurant are an insult to our race, and we are going to try to have them removed," Douglas said. "I know of a number of Negroes in other places who want to come to Missoula to live, and they expect to come to a place where they will be treated decently." The church also sponsored annual barbecues in Greeno Park and frequent Jubilee Choir performances where members sang traditional Black spirituals. Those events brought significant numbers of white citizens and was a means through which the community could associate with its Black citizens in different ways than they would in other spaces in town. In the 1930s, St. Paul AME had a women's club called the Martha Washington Club, who held special education events on Black history, including a Frederick Douglass Memorial, a series of talks during Negro History Week, and a Lincoln Memorial. Black women throughout Montana have played a huge role in sponsoring active civic engagement aimed at education and fighting negative stereotypes. So here's what I referred to earlier. In the early 1920s, the Missoulian had several ads for the Triumphant Ten Lodge number 29 F and AM, which was a Black fraternal society that met twice a month at the old Union Hall. That was led by Solomon Dorsey and his nephew Esmond, both frequently named AME church members. So I do think the church played a huge role in keeping a small but robust Black population in town during the 1910s, 20s, and 30s. It created a stable institution for folks could draw from for support. And it's something you see in all towns in Montana that had a Black church. And I'm working with a group of people who are actually hoping to memorialize the church with a plaque on the property where it existed and with a mural that we're really hoping that we can get done somewhere in town, hopefully on the northwest side of town. If you're interested in more information on that, let me know. So by the end of the 1930s, Missoula's Black population started to decline significantly. The Black population declined by 36% between 1930 and 1940, and then by 33% between 1940 and 1950. And now Montana as a whole is the least Black state in the country. As of recent estimates, Montana has fewer Black people in number than the state of Wyoming, which has almost half of Montana's total population. Neighboring states like North Dakota and South Dakota also have larger numbers and proportions than Montana, also both regional states with smaller populations. So it seems undeniable that the Great Depression and World War II would have created massive upheaval in Missoula's economic realities, shifting the nature of the jobs that were available and who was able to get those jobs. But for a town to grow significantly less Black while simultaneously growing its white population speaks to a significantly different economic life for both groups. And it's really my hope that historians and scholars of Montana history can elucidate the mechanics of this shift. Another aspect that I think of is essential to understand, and one that I'm only recently trying to kind of grapple with, is the role that Montana's 1909 interracial marriage ban played on increasing the precariousness of Black life in Montana. So you can see the wording there: an act prohibiting marriage between white persons and Negroes, persons of Negro blood, and between white persons, Chinese and Japanese, and making such marriages void and prescribing punishment for solemnizing such unions. So try to look at that from the perspective of a young Black person growing up in Missoula, looking to establish a family with roots here. With the passage of the interracial marriage ban, your choice of mates suddenly has been severely curtailed. In 1910, there were only 18 Black residents in the prime marital age between 17 and 23. By 1920, the number of Black Missoulians in that age range is just 6. In fact, the largest age demographic drop between 1910 and 1920 are those aged 17 to 29. In 1910, they represented 27% of Missoula's Black population. By 1920, that age group fell to just 12%. No other age group dropped that much. I don't know exactly what to make of that specifically. I'm not claiming a direct cause and effect, but it's why I think it's worth further exploration. Because when you consider Montana had no large metropolitan centers, a law like that seems guaranteed to exclude and push people out of the state. And while there still were some interracial marriages during this time, the power of the state to nullify or deny protections would be a consistently looming threat. And you can see here from a divorce document in 1949, when the law was still in effect, it was sufficient reason enough to grant a divorce. So as you can see here, Eddie Joyner, who he had run the Hawthorne Club here in Missoula, lost custody of his son with this decision. So here's an image of the house that sits at 1427 Phillips Street, next door to my house. Obviously, you would never know that that had been a Black church for nearly 3 decades. I can't tell you if the building, exactly what happened to the building, if it had been completely torn down or if it had just been remodeled and renovated. When my wife and I moved right next door to this house, we were told within the first year of living here that it had been the former Lowell School building. But it wasn't until nearly 20 years later, when I decided to look into that I found its other historical significance. This isn't the result of active suppression or nefarious racist entities trying to remove this from our memory. It's something kind of sadder and more reflective of how white supremacy works. The greater white community never valued its existence, and the families who left and the church that stopped holding services were forgotten like paper in the wind. And while I'm sorry this presentation lacks such a visually important element as photographs of other photographs, we don't have any pictures of the church. We don't have any pictures of the barbecues that were held in Green Oak Park. I would say its absence is part of the story here and represents the challenges inherent in researching a marginalized community. So I want to end with a passage from historian Anthony Wood. His forthcoming book titled Black Montana, Settler Colonialism and the Erosion of the Racial Frontier, 1877 to 1930, that speaks to this same underlying process. This book will be coming out later this year and something I'm really looking forward to reading. Anthony Wood has done great work and has helped me understand the fundamental role that Missoula's St. Paul AME Church, for example, played in maintaining the early Black population. He's also blessed with being a wonderful writer. So in the introduction, he starts by discussing the work that he and AGIS staff member of Montana Historical Society did, creating a digital map of Helena as part of the project to document the history of Helena's historic Black community. And about that, he writes, "It quickly became evident that the map told a more ominous tale than we had anticipated. In the several distinct Black neighborhoods and the lively downtown business district that held dozens of Black enterprises throughout the years, fewer than 20% of all houses, tenements, or storefronts once occupied by African Americans now remain. Urban renewal initiatives in the 1970s and 1980s removed many buildings from Montana's capital. For it was that by the mid-20th century, too few Black residents from that era remained in Helena to fight for their cultural heritage. This was what the map so poignantly spoke to. Not the physical removal of the Black community per se, but the ongoing intangible legacy of erosion, scouring the history of African Americans from the land, as well as their experience and stories from the collective memory of the community. And it's my hope that interested people from differing backgrounds and experiences can shed more light on this from both local and statewide perspective. There's a wealth of research that can be done to help Montanans better understand their connection to our current reality. And that is the end.
All right, well, thank you so much. We've got a couple questions that have come in. If anyone else has questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. We've got just about 10 minutes left. So the first question is referring to back to the property disputes. Were there official covenants against selling property to non-whites in Missoula?
So I know that there are racially restrictive covenants on the south side of Missoula, and up in the hills in the south side area. I know that happened. I've looked at deeds around here, and they don't specifically state that in anything that I've seen. I mean, I've looked at the deed on our house. It doesn't state that, but I mean, obviously you didn't, if you were able to organize with white real estate agents and landlords so publicly and in the newspaper and pressure them to not do that, that you didn't even need to have a racially restrictive covenant to bar access.
And then our next question is about biracial couples. And it asks, did anything happen to biracial couples in Missoula? Specifically, like, where did they live, especially pre-1908?
There's quite a few, 5 to 7 couples, I want to say, in Missoula, and they lived in different parts of the town. And I've looked, and I haven't seen a lot of, especially, before, things really started to ramp up around the early 1900s. Definitely around the time that act was passed. There are some articles that actually are interesting to it and frightening to read about. There was a panic over some interracial marriages, and the paper had pointed out that, which I just ran across this, so I'm going to get the wording wrong, but they said that basically the people were not, the counties that approved this were not going to be approved by God or something to that extent for allowing those marriages on their books. But it's funny. I think things really ramp up in intensity between 1805 to 1830. I mean, to the 1940s, really. I mean, 1905 to the 1940s. James Lowen calls that the nadir of race relations. And I'm not saying there was no racism earlier on. It seemed to get a lot more intense. Definitely, I think it's definitely related to the fact that the population was growing too.
Our next question asks, what were the resources for information about Black history in Laramie, Wyoming?
I looked at the census, basically. I've done some searching on reading about Empire, Wyoming. But yeah, you can look at I just quickly went over to the manuscript census and just sort of looked to see there. And I think I actually asked Anthony about other parts of that county other than just the fort, because and Cheyenne had quite a few people as well. I know that Wyoming is a place that I think that people are looking at more and closely now, because there's a lot of interesting history in Wyoming.
And this is just a follow-up from me. Do you know if the Wyoming and Montana censuses from that time are available for free, or are they some of the ones that are paywalled in Ancestry?
Yeah, I mean, you can probably get them. I mean, not digitally. You can probably you'd have to, request library access to it or something, I'm assuming. I mean, that's a lot of the thing here, is that I've been able to find so many things because of, I have to pay for a subscription to newspapers and for Ancestry, but those things are so much closer to our fingertips now by just doing keyword searches. But yeah, if you don't pay the subscription fees, unfortunately, now you don't have access to those, and I think that's too bad. I mean, if we have the capability of making them digital, I don't think people should have to pay for that. That's our history. I mean, I would love to see a sort of a national campaign to get, documents like that just out there and accessible to the public.
That would be amazing. Our next question asks if you have any comments on the 25th Infantry dealing with discarded white military equipment and the bicycles in particular, but kind of how that military racism plays into the whole thing.
I'm not sure. I haven't really thought about that. Maybe expand on that? I'm not sure.
Yeah, if our questioner wants to drop some more details about like what specifically you'd like us to answer, that would be wonderful. While we're waiting for that, our next question says, why do you think the opposition to African Americans moving into neighborhoods in Missoula seemed to accelerate around 1910?
Well, just because of the growth. I mean, I'm assuming between 1900 and 1910, and because, I mean, what you're seeing historic Northwest Side is a working class district. I mean, it is called the historic and Northwest Side neighborhood because of its history of being a working class neighborhood, where large numbers of people working for the railroads, people working for the lumber industry, were living and could set roots here. And actually, I was just reading the National Registry document about the historic West and North Side, and it actually mentions that it was a racially tolerant area, and I kind of question that now. There were definitely some very notable Black people living in that area, but I mean, I think the opposition they're challenging. It's how race and class can diverge. I mean, they're essentially the same class, but they're trying to bar them from access into a neighborhood where you could really grow roots and become part of a community. And that's the way I see it.
Our next question asks, I wonder if restrictions on employment may have pushed people out. The passenger railroad jobs went away after World War II.
Oh yeah, I mean, and that's again. For me, I think I wish historians there were more historians to explore this, like the nature of the barriers. I mean, because you can see it. Like I've looked through 1920 census, for example, and I just took note of everybody that was born in a different country that spoke a different language and immigrated here, at like the age of 20, with so many cultural barriers, language being the main one. And they were able to get jobs in the railroad. They were able to move up and develop their lives here in Missoula in the logging industry. There's a lot of people from Sweden, Norway, Finland, and they're coming here without speaking the language. And then there are Black people here, some have been 25th Infantry soldiers. There's this, they weren't allowed access to that, but like finding the specific, records that say, employment, either correspondence or something in about hiring practices that will say, yeah, we aren't hiring Black people. You need to, I think it's just important to find as many of those sources as you can to help people understand how these barriers exist and how they are, how it works.
Have a question here about Fort Harrison. The question asks, do you have any suggestions in where to look for more info on Buffalo soldiers at Fort Harrison? The State Military Museum doesn't have muster rolls, and I'm trying to figure out who was there around 1903.
Yeah, so that was something I dealt with too, trying to do this search on for Missoula residents and that could connect with Fort Missoula. So again, it's something where you have to subscribe to Ancestry and also Fold 3. They have digitized military archives, and there's, I can send this person if they're interested, the archives that I've searched, and I find so many things of names of people from Fort Missoula, just a lot of information just about, daily activities at Fort Missoula. They took lots of notes, and a lot of that is now accessible. So I'm assuming that's the same for Fort Harrison. And I can provide them with, specific links and things to that.
Awesome. We have a follow-up about the 25th Infantry question. And they say just the fact that the 25th Infantry and others were equipped with arms, etc., deemed outmoded or unreliable by white units. And also the experiment of turning the soldiers into bicyclists, and, the fact that it was the black soldiers in particular who had to slog their way to St. Louis.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess I can't speak to that. I haven't looked into that, but I'm sure there's some truth in that. Yeah.
I will say just very quickly to that, one of the reasons it was that unit in particular had to do with their white commanding officer who had the bicycles as his pet project. But yes, the fact that this was a black unit probably contributed to why they were slogging through the mud, let's say.
And they were experimenting on a different way of marching as a cavalry unit, right? Sort of pre-motor or pre-vehicles or.
Yeah, the idea was using bicycles to replace cavalry.
Yeah.
But
horses, but yeah, I'm sure that would be an interesting, thing to look at in itself. Just the arms that they got, the actual equipment that they received. Was it hand-me-downs or what?
Yeah. Just a quick comment about census data. So most of the country/urban level demographic data is available online through scanned documents. You just don't have the individual level data. So we have started.
Right. That's right. I should have pointed that out. Sorry. Yeah. You can get the overview, the overview census, which gives you the population counts. But it's really, like what I found, like looking through the actual manuscript documents, which is what they're using to tabulate those numbers, can be, and it gives you the names. That's the key for me, is getting names of people that then I can use, newspapers.com to do searches for those names. You just have so many more personally identifiable information to help you do research.
Absolutely. We have one more question. Was the law forbidding biracial couples ever repealed?
Yeah,
1954,
somewhere in there, 53, 54, somewhere in there in the 50s. Yeah, it was on the books for a long time. That's the 1950s is the point. Montana had just declined so much. It's just, it would be interesting to do more history or exploration of the effect of that law.
And then finally, we have a comment saying that there is a list of soldiers stationed at Fort Harrison posted on the Missoula Historical Society African American Heritage Resources website. And also they've put the URL here, which I will put in chat. Thank you very much for sharing that resource.
Yes,
and
awesome.
Also, that heritage website is amazing.
Yes, it is.
Want to put that out.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I should have mentioned that earlier. It's what I've used a lot of to help inform the stuff that I'm looking at. I'm so thankful for that project.
I'm just scrolling through chat to see if we have anything in here. We have a question. I used to live in Miles City. I'm curious about the parallels of the Buffalo Soldiers and the Black communities there, which was small and dwindled away.
I'm not sure I can shed much light on that. The only thing I can say that I know of that I ran across, I mentioned James Lowen. He's written a book called Sundown Towns, which was documenting towns that had an active policy of telling any Black people trying to live there that they had to leave by the time the sun went down. And he has a database by state of reported or potential or confirmed sundown towns. And I know Miles City is actually on there. I looked at the link and there isn't really there isn't a smoking gun there. So I remember, I think that, that's what people can do if they're interested, is to try to look into this themselves too. That's what I loved about James Lowen. He was, and it encouraged me to start look at just his website, and he gives you the tools and tells you how to go about looking at it. And I think you got to be careful. You got to learn things, learn general history when you're doing it. But yeah, I mean, we can find this information if we look.
Definitely. And there've been a lot of links dropped in the chat. We will kind of collect all of those and put them up with the recording of this webinar, so you guys don't have to like scribble them down frantically. But that is all the questions that we have, and we are slightly past time. So I think we're going to wrap it up. Thank you so much, Greg. That was really interesting, really well done.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks everybody for attending and being interested in this and caring about this, because it's just so important.
Definitely. So we are hoping to come back with more webinars in this series in the fall. So stay tuned for that, and have a wonderful rest of your afternoon.
Thanks, everybody.